Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker today, John Duynisveld, who will be discussing bale grazing. John is a beef research biologist at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada's Kentville Research and Development Centre. So good morning, John, and welcome.
Well, good morning, and thanks for the introduction, Matthew. I guess good afternoon from my end of the world. So, just get my screen going here. Everything good on this chair?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I'm gonna chat with you about bale grazing here for a little while. It's interesting because I'm out on the east coast of Canada, so Nova Scotia. We're right on the ocean here, and I first got interested and got my start in bale grazing from a former colleague of mine from Alberta named Wayne McCart, and he had been talking about bale grazing, and it kind of piqued my interest in the early 2000s and kind of grew from there. Okay. Yeah. So I'll just give you a little bit of my background. So I kind of wear two hats in the farm world. I do research with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada in the Nepean Research Farm, which is located on the border between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. We've got about 600 acres of forage and cropland. We were 125, 30 head, but we've scaled back a little bit to 100 head cow calf to finish. We have a supply feed for a neighboring bull test station. And our research is largely in the areas of pasture management, beef nutrition, and then we have some forage agronomy and forage breeding that takes place as well. And we started bale grazing at Nepean in 2011, actually in response to some labor cuts that happened through the federal government. So we lost about 40% of our workforce. Um, Management had suggested that maybe we should, look at cutting back their herd. At that time, we were calving in January, February, and so I sat down with the crew that was left at on the the worker side, and we came up with a plan to start calving in April, May, and go with bale grazing, just for the simple fact that it simplifies the feeding process, minimizes the amount of bedding we would need and the amount of manure we would have to spread. Um, it was easy enough for me to suggest that because on my own farm at home, I had been bale grazing since about 2004, so I had a bit of experience in how that could work and sort of what some of our challenges might be and hopefully how to address them. So yeah, so on my own farm, Haldanka Farms, we have about 300 acres of land that we manage. We own most of that. It's a mix of naturalized pasture for the most part. And actually we do grass-fed beef, grass-fed lamb, pastured pigs, and pastured poultry. So first I just want to cover for those of you that are not familiar with bale grazing. So bale grazing is a way of extending the grazing season, but using a stored feed option. So with bale grazing, sort of in its purest sense, you would place the bales out on the field where you are choosing to do your bale grazing. Hopefully you want to kind of minimize the handling as much as possible. So in my own case at home, when we bring the bales home from field or when we buy them in, they go directly to the fields we're going to graze them. We'll set them up in a little grid pattern and just ration them out with electric fence. And it really is great in the winter. Like from my own experience, you don't have to fire up a tractor. You just have to, well, in the worst case scenario, I had to snowshoe out and move electric fence. But it's very simple, very low cost way of feeding animals compared to feeding them in the barn or in a feed yard. And it's as you go through and learn how to address some of your challenges, it can be quite effective. And why maybe would you choose to bale graze as opposed to some of your other options like feeding in a barn or feeding in a feed yard? Overwintering typically on most farms is about 60 to 80% of our total costs for cow calf production. And this includes a lot of things, including your barn or your yard maintenance, your feed, of course, and the cost of feeding the feed, any bedding material, manure spreading, handling, the equipment that goes along with all of that, and the fuel and the labor. And with bale grazing, we try to minimize that down to more or less just the feed and the labor, and try to have the animals and do all the work for us. Because essentially, the less reliant we are on feeding these conserved feeds in a barn or a yard, hopefully the better our bottom line can be. No guarantees on that, of course. This is just an example from my home farm of our bale grazing setup for our sheep in the winter of 2022. That was actually the second year we bale grazed with our sheep, which presents a few different challenges from the cows. I'll lightly touch on that. But these were bales that we bought in, and when they arrived, we just set them out in the field where we wanted to feed them. The sheep were going back and forth to the barn for shelter and water, and yeah, it was worked out fairly well. Um, I just want to address a little bit about why you would bale graze versus maybe using either a stockpiled pasture, standing pasture, or swath grazing. Um, and I've got a little bit of experience with both, more so on the stockpiled side of things. Stockpiled perennials in particular are really, really great. You know, you have really low upfront cost. It's really just a matter of your management, making sure you have enough time for that stockpile to grow, have it ready for grazing in the fall and winter. However, at least in our part of the world here, sometimes we can get some fairly deep snow, and in particular snow that it might thaw a couple of times and forms into a fairly icy crust, which can make it difficult for the animals to break through that crust. And they end up expending a lot of energy just trying to get enough energy to keep themselves warm through the day, just pushing the snow out of the way and having to go around and find that feed. So that's sort of where it becomes limiting. Swath grazing is an incredibly economical way of feeding beef cows through the winter. I know just from having conversations, and I gave a webinar a few years ago with Barron in Alberta. He's done a lot of work with swath grazing. Basically, you plant typically an annual of some sort, often based on different small cereals. And at the end of the growing season, you swath that into big windrows, which concentrates the feed in a nice swath, which when the snow starts to fall, it makes it much easier for the animals to access that feed and not have to fight through so much snow to get there. However, weathering of the feed and loss of protein and energy can take place. It happens enough in sort of in a drier environment like in Western Canada or down through the Midwestern states. But we tried this one year with our research at Nepan, and my goodness, we have so much moisture and so much warm and cold and up and down temperatures through November, December, even into January, that the quality of the feed deteriorated so quickly. It just wasn't worth feeding to the cows by mid-January. So bale grazing, it's got more of a cost than either the perennial stockpiling or swath grazing, because you have that mechanical cost associated with making the bales themselves. But on the positive side, it really concentrates that feed in a small area, especially when you start dealing with a fair bit of snow or ice, and so it makes it easier for the animals to find what they need, and reduces that risk of weathering of the feed quality that we get with swath grazing. And it gives us a nice little benefit of being able to, if we're buying in the hay, we can import these nutrients on farm, or we can move these nutrients with it through our bales to lower fertility fields that might need that fertility, along with getting the feed value for our livestock. Um, we started bale grazing in Japan in 2011, and we did a little bit of a cost of production study. We had a grad student who published a paper on this. And essentially, we found about a 54% reduction in winter feed costs using extended grazing and bale grazing with an April calving cow herd. So in 2014 to 2016, that average saving was about $240 per head, which at that time was fairly significant. I updated these numbers a year ago using 2023 costs, and that time we were showing about a $430 saving per cow per year. And then this is all versus feeding cattle in a barn in a yard. So I mean, it's a pretty substantial amount of money. If you take a 100-cow herd, that's $43,000 a year. It's worth maybe trying investigating as an option. And with our research, we found the cattle on the bale grazing, they had a very similar weight gains and body condition scores to the barn-fed cattle. There's just a picture of our cows on a nice stormy day in February, grazing away. Also, CanFax, which does a lot of economic research, kind of extension side of things for the Canadian beef industry, they did a beef cost of production study with some maritime producers. And so for the group of producers that were using winter grazing, they had a savings of about $500 per cow per year compared to those were feeding in the barns and yards. Now they weren't all using bale grazing. There's a lot of corn grazing, I think, actually used in this. But I guess the point being that having the animals out of the barn, out into the field where they're doing more of the harvesting and spreading that manure themselves is quite a significant saving. So the mechanics of bale grazing is really it's also great to bring your kids into too. My kids are actually all grown now and finishing up university. They hate it when I bring pictures of them with as kids into the. So that's why I do it. But so you set the bales up in in the fall of the year ideally. Although in Japan we actually set them up about 2 or 3 weeks in advance take them from rows that are wrapped in silage plastic just to minimize the weathering, especially if we end up carrying them over from one year to the next. Typically they would be arranged in a grid pattern, and that helps control your nutrient distribution and also just makes it quite easy actually to set up your fences. So with beef cattle, it's very easy to use just a single wire fence. The first couple of years I was doing this, I was cursing the frozen ground, and then talking to Dwayne out in Alberta, and he said, "Well, yeah, you just stick the posts in the bale, and you don't even have to think about the ground." It's brilliant. Yeah, should have thought of that. Anyway, so it's really quite simple. With sheep, actually, when we started doing bale grazing with the sheep, we had to make a slightly different fence post to have the multi-wire fencing work. We ended up having it with a 5-wire fence just because when the ground is frozen and you get a layer of ice there, the shock doesn't always work so well on a 2 or 3-wire fence for sheep. So 5 was a little more work, but still a whole lot less work than feeding sheep in the barn and having to spread that manure. Um, so discussion that always is kind of a part of bale grazing is when you go to set your field up for bale grazing, how far apart do you put the bales? And a lot of it, it really comes down to kind of what you're hoping to achieve with that. In this example here, this is one of my fields at home where this was the farthest field from the barn, really low fertility, never really got the manure back when my parents had a dairy farm. So we put the bales on more or less a 40 or 50-foot grid and fed the cows there all winter. Was worked out fairly good. Typically, people will say anywhere between 25 to 50-foot spacings. And again, depends on your goal, depends on your soil type, what you're looking for. Everyone's situation is going to be a little bit different. This is a picture of sheep bale grazing. So, uh, yeah, the first time I did this with the sheep, there's a few different little learning curves. We did end up using a baler ring around the bales, which are light enough that I could just roll them around by hand. Although when some of my staff were doing that, or a little smaller than me, they would actually use the tractor to move the rings, but we didn't have to move the bales themselves. Just kept them from wasting so much hay and from having the bales fall on the sheep when they chew off one side and not the other. Um, so other questions that come around with bale grazing, and there's sort of two that to me really merge together. One is the efficiency of the hay use. So how much waste do you have versus and how hard do you push them? And that's really tied in my mind a lot with the frequency of moving. So do you move them like every day? Do you move them once a week, once a month? And I know people that do all of those scenarios depending upon what your goals are, what your time is like. But if you want to have a more efficient use of that hay, then you want to move them a little more often. But it depends as well on the quality of the feed. If you're really nice, maybe like a second cut alfalfa hay, they're gonna vacuum that up like nothing anyway. Your waste can be fairly minimal, especially if you're moving them maybe 2 or 3 times a week. With a coarser hay where there's a lot more stem, they'll be a little more selective. Maybe you don't want them to graze all of that. If they were to try and eat all of that stem, then maybe it might not meet their needs. So you want to leave a little more behind. You want them to put on a little more body condition. The weather might be a factor in that. Some interesting work they did I believe it was in Lakeland area in Alberta, where they looked at bale placement on the end or on the side, and they found that placing the bales on the flat side, they actually wasted more hay than when they were laid on the round side. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, and just how often you move them to new bales, they'll tend to ignore the older bales and use them for bedding and go on and be grazing off of the new bales. So yeah, there's been a little bit of research done on this efficiency of use, and Lakeland Agricultural Research, they found between 7 and 16%. hay waste. And then the Canadian agronomist reports some research that was done in Manitoba around 21% waste. But I did a little digging into this too, and with bale feeders, so most like sort of a ring type feeder that doesn't have any kind of covering on the bottom, so it's just basically a sort of almost like an open mesh. A pile of research, Oklahoma State did some really good work on this, found around 20 to 23% waste on those open ring feeders. And to get below 10%, you need a fairly modified heavy duty feeder that limits the amount of hay for them to be able to pull over the top of. Then you can get around that 4 to 10%. So bale grazing doesn't necessarily have a huge additional waste compared to using a bale feeder. But again, it has some of these lower costs and simplicity in use. Um, very important when you're bring cattle outside when they don't have as much shelter that they have good body condition and clean air. These cows are in the middle of a snowstorm. Temperatures probably like will be between -10, -15 Celsius, and a pretty good wind chill. But you can see the snow sitting on their backs. They're doing just fine. Another thing we borrowed from out west along with the bale grazing was the use of portable wind fences just to be able to move around with the cattle. Helps you to spread the nutrients a little more if you want to move it within season or from year to year. Um, Snow can get fairly deep sometimes around here, and I know it can a lot of other places that have used bale grazing. But when you have a fair bit of wind with the snow, you'll see that actually around the bales, the wind tends to swirl, so the snow doesn't get so deep. So that gives you the cows a little more opportunity to access those bales. It does make the fencing a little more challenging. Then in 2015 here, we had a year where we had no snow until the first week of February, and then twice a week every week we'd get 4, 5, 6 inches of snow, which means by the second, third week of March, we had between 3 and 4 feet of snow everywhere out in the fields. So that year, fencing, my cows were out bale grazing, and that's where my feed was. So that's where I had to feed them. Essentially, my bale grazing method involved me snowshoeing the 1.5 kilometers out back from the barn to where the cows were, and scraping off the tops of the bales, snowshoeing a little trail, and they would follow their way over, scatter a little hay, and they did incredibly well. Actually, I feel this is probably one of the years when we had the least waste because there was no mud or anything associated with it. So anyway, with no snow, it works well, but the cows are quite resourceful at making their way through deep snow as well. Soil fertility is really a big opportunity with bale grazing, but it doesn't happen just on its own. There's some challenges with that. So the amount of fertility you can expect to get from bale grazing, essentially it depends on the tonnage of bales you're putting out per acre and the mineral content of the feed. So if you're feeding something like a nice alfalfa hay, that you're going to have a fair bit more fertility maybe than like a more mature grass that has a lot more stem, just a lot less concentration of those minerals in it. The efficiency of mineral utilization by the livestock that are grazing, there's a lot of variables that'll determine that. But I tried to find some information about this, and it seems like somewhere from 80 to 90% of the mineral eaten by the animal will be excreted in the feces and the urine. Although there's a lot of variability around this, and it's not that they're not necessarily absorbing what's in the feed that they're eating, but there's also just a lot of cycling that goes on within the mineral stores within their bodies. So there's the stuff that they're done with gets research done in Manitoba. They showed residual soil nitrate levels ranging from 1.25 to over 213 pounds of nitrogen per acre, which huge range. And on that upper end, like that's pretty significant amount of fertility. The nutrient that's most likely to see the biggest increase is potassium, and that's forages tend to be highest in potassium. Typically, I think about 3 times as much potassium as there is phosphorus, which would be the other nutrient of concern. In the Ag Canada perspective at Nepan, our strategy with the bale grazing is we'll bale graze a field in 2 consecutive years, and our row of bales will offset them from year to year, so we get fairly uniform concentration of nutrients across the whole field. The third year, we'll just graze that field to let any residue that's left behind decompose. And then for years 4 and years 5, we'll grow corn silage on that, and then we're able to reduce our fertility need. We probably don't reduce as much as we should, but the opportunity is there. When you are bale grazing, you want to be mindful of the runoff risks for nitrogen, phosphorus, especially on slopes, or when you're doing a fairly concentrated feeding of the bales. And if your soils are fairly high in sand or gravel, then it's great to think about trying to increase your organic matter levels using bale grazing, but keep in mind that a lot of those nutrients can also flow down through that soil. So I want to be mindful of that. As far as the impact on yield from that fertility, research in Saskatchewan published in 2011, they found very significant increases in their forage growth in their bale graze paddocks. They attributed this to improved water infiltration rates, higher soil moisture, and better phosphorus and potassium fertility. And some research in Alberta found between 100 to 200% increases in forage yield on their bale graze sites. So I know when you do a quick Google search on bale grazing, you will find indications of reduced yield in the year following bale grazing. That's largely in places where it's just a drier environment, so it takes more time for that residual feed to break down. It's actually some of my early days home this summer residual in February when the cows were done with this row of bales, and by mid-May, we're starting to see a fair bit of grass coming up through that. Now we have a lot of rainfall here. We're like I think it's 30 to 40 inches of rain, and it's pretty evenly distributed except through July and August. So a lot of that residue will break down fairly quickly here in the Maritimes. This is some of our sheep bale grazing aftermath. It looks like a couple sheep exploded here, but spring of the year, they do start to lose their wool. Dealing with this residue, like, kind of challenge. The first year we bale grazed it in a pan, we had thought we were going to put corn in it in year 1, and that resulted in a lot of hay wedged up into our tillage equipment. But really, like, it depends on the feed you're feeding and how well you're able to get them to clean up what's there, and how much contact that hay residue has with the soil. In wetter environments, it's going to break down a lot more quickly, obviously. And that's why in the pan we'll leave those fields for 1 year before we try to do any cropping. Some species of forages will grow through that residue a lot better, like rhizomatous grasses. They will come up through that. Things like bluegrass and couch grass. Bunch grasses like tall fescue and orchard grass aren't so quick to come through that residue. They just don't work as well that way. You want to be mindful of weed seeds, especially if you're into sensitive areas like some of the native rangelands. You don't want to necessarily bring invasive species in. But on that note too, you can I've been playing around with this for a few years of using bale grazing to bring new species into a field. So I've got a couple of fields that have a fair bit of trefoil in them. I'll let that trefoil go to seed before I make that hay to feed to my dry cows in the winter, and that seed can then be transferred into these new areas. This is where there was a bale 2 years previous. So just a picture of my sheep bale grazing. This should be where the blue circle is. You can see where the bales from the year before had been. And so this is actually in, oh goodness, this would be in April of the year after these fields were grazed. And actually in a lot of these circles you see where the bales were, it's actually quite green. There's just when that residue material and the manure and the urine gets used by these plants, you get quite a flush of growth, and it actually will become quite noticeable. And there's a longer term impact to that residue. One of the first fields I bale grazed in, I was going through, well, this would be, I guess it was in 2018. I was going through, this is my pre-drone days, so I couldn't get a good picture of this, but you could see these circles where the bales had been, and this was 10 years after we bale grazed it. But these circles, you could see a noticeable difference in the forage composition. So the one on the one side here where the bale grazed, it had a lot more clover, and very, very dense, whereas the not bale grazed one looked, that looked pretty good too. But to dig down and look at the soil in the bale grazed side was quite a bit darker and quite a bit more moist. And this would have been in late July, so we start to get into our drier time of the year. And God, I hate to say that when I know there's people from really dry environments like Emily who's talking next. So this is our dry time of the year, which is still nice and green forages. But really noticeable difference in the color and in the moisture content of that. And again, this is 10 years after the bale grazing. Some of the other things that we've done with this bale grazing, one of the opportunities you get. So these sheep are bale grazing here in a field that had been annual ryegrass the year before. Just an incredible opportunity to just come in and broadcast. Well, red clover seed is what I used here. It's an incredible catch. So it gave me a good crop of red clover to graze the following growing season. So just a few final thoughts on this. If you're interested in bale grazing, like anything on a person's farm, does it fit with what your goals are? If it's great to be able to say maybe you can save some money and you can get some fertility out there maybe where you have a harder time getting it to for other reasons. But it's also you've got to be able to get out there. You feed and shelter, or you need shelter and water for your cows. It works within this winter context, and depending upon if you're working a 9-to-5 job in the winter when you have pretty short days, it might not be so easy to get out there and move those cattle when you need to. Just like any situation, really, soil tests and feed tests can help you make decisions on how you might choose to do your bale grazing and where you would choose to do it. And like so many things too, start small if you're trying something new like bale grazing. Find someone who's maybe got some experience, see what might work, especially someone who's maybe closer to your area, because we have different challenges here than what people in Alberta or Saskatchewan might have. And I always have a plan B for when something goes wrong. I mean, it happens all the time. Yeah, just a little shot of graze, and that will be all I have to say right now. I'll turn it back over to Matthew.
Awesome. Thanks, John. So our next presenter is Emily Fulstone, and she is the cattle operations manager for RN Fulstone Company and is located in Nevada foothills of the Sierra Mountain Range. Emily will be presenting on regenerative management for us today. So good morning, Emily, and welcome.
Hi, everyone. I'm gonna see if I can switch over to our presentation here. All right. So my name is Emily Fulstone. I am located in Smith Valley, Nevada, which is very different than what John was dealing with. We are a very, very arid, dry climate. We get about 9 inches of rainfall a year. We're also high alpine, so we are at about 4,500 feet. And what I really wanted to talk about today is kind of when nutrient management comes to mind, the biggest thing that we started focusing on, and once we understood it, really helped us change our plant nutrition, which also then impacts our animal nutrition, is epigenetics and vermicompost. And so to give a little background on myself, I have a degree in environmental science and biology. I've been coaching regenerative ag now for about 8 years. And my family is a 7th generation cattle ranch in Nevada. We run about 1,200 head cow-calf operation of Black Angus. Our cattle spend probably 80% of their life actually out on permits. So we're fortunate enough that our cattle run on Forest Service or BLM land, but then we also raise about 3,000 acres of farmland, and the majority of our crops are alfalfa for dairy feed, cattle feed, and then we also raise some hay crops as well. And so we'll kind of get into a little bit of our journey and how we saw a lot of our nutrients change in our plants kind of through some stuff that we worked on. So what is epigenetics? Epigenetics is the study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than an alteration of genetic code itself. What the hell does that mean? What that really is how our environment around us actually turns on and off different genes. And once we started to think about this with our plants, it really impacted our change in how we started focusing on how to fertilize them. And so what it is as you have an environment, your plants are going to react to that, whether we are fertilizing them. If we're fertilizing them, they're going to express certain genes. Whether we're spraying pesticides, they're going to express certain genes. Whether you have water that has high alkali, which is what we have, your plants are going to start expressing certain genes, and they're going to grow in a different way based on that. So, you know, what does that really mean? Why do we care? Well, our environment is constantly changing and it affects the genes that are expressed. In farming, this is going to have a direct impact on growing our plants, how drought tolerant they are, how tasty they are to our cattle, which is super important. We want high palatability in our feeds. And then the biggest thing, you know, for me as a producer is my checkbook. How much fertilizer do they actually need? Can I get them to use less fertilizer in the long run? So to kind of understand how we can decide what we're going to do with that, we need to go back to, you know, some high school biology, and we need to look at the soil food web. And so we have our soil food web here, and it starts with animals and plants on the surface. Those plants are going to be photosynthesizing. So they're taking in CO2, releasing oxygen. They're going to convert that CO2 into sugars, which are complex carbohydrates that they're actually going to inject into the ground. And they're going to be feeding all of our microbiology. All of our microbiology is our bacteria, our fungi. In turn, our bacteria and fungi start feeding our nematodes, our protozoas. Those start feeding our arthropods. Our arthropods start feeding our rodents and our birds. And it all cycles back into those plants as rodents, birds, cattle put manure, urea on the ground, feeding those plants. And I know some people will hear nematodes and be terrified, but there's lots of different kinds of nematodes out there that actually are beneficial nematodes that release a lot of nutrients into the ground. There are root feeding nematodes, but they have a lot of predators if you have this functioning, happy soil food web. And this is what happens when we are outside of a very industrial farm setting where we're not putting lots of chemical fertilizers out on the soil. You know, this is our very healthy, idyllic, balanced soil system. Well, so as farmers do, back in the 1940s, we started producing chemical fertilizers. So we thought, perfect, we'll take the cows off. We've made this awesome product. Let's put chemical fertilizers out there. Well, what happens when we add chemical fertilizers is these plants are now getting the nutrients that they want for free. And plants, when they're photosynthesizing, they're injecting sugars down into the ground to feed that soil food web. And in return, they're actually getting nutrients back into the plant. That's 40% of the sugars that plants produce actually goes into the ground to feed this soil food web in the ground. In return, they get nutrients. Well, when plants get those nutrients for free, rather than having to feed our soil, they actually will stop producing exudates and those complex carbohydrates that they're putting into the soil that's feeding our bacteria. So with that, we start having less organic matter in our soil. And an important thing to think about is that bacteria and microorganisms are also organic matter. It's so often that I see that people think of organic matter as just root matter or compost. They're not actually thinking about all of that bacteria, all of that fungi is organic matter itself. That's a huge amount of your organic matter. So the more biology you have in your soil, actually the higher your organic matter is going to end up being. So we have less organic matter because that carbon is no longer going down into our soil systems. We're losing that bacteria. So we're going to have more soil compaction. We're going to have reduced water infiltration rates. Well, then as we start doing that, we're going to start losing all of our good bacteria, our fungi, and our predatory nematodes that are going to keep these root feeding nematodes from eating on our plants. So now with chemical fertilizers, we've broken down our system to where we don't have this little symbiotic relationship going on in our soil. Our plants are still growing because they're getting the nutrients they need from us. But now they're starting to show signs of disease, pressure, maybe some pest pressure. So how do we fix it? Well, we have, increased root feeding nematodes. We start spending money on pesticides as well as chemical fertilizers. And maybe some people start even spending money on fungicides. So now we're trying to add band-aids to fix the problem that comes from taking this plant out of a very balanced soil food web. So what we need to do is get back to this right here. And the question is, how do we accomplish that? And this is where epigenetics comes in to play, is so when we start looking at GMO seeds or nitrogen coated seeds, we can actually have some issues. And the reason being is that plants that are getting chemicals from the farmer are having the genes expressed that they do not need to feed their soil biology. They no longer need to try and produce that really big, robust soil food web because they're getting the nutrients for free. That actually turns on a gene. And we've seen this in our ranch with nitrogen coated seeds. So when I have plants that at germination come into contact with nitrogen or a antifungal, what's happening is they're not making a relationship with bacteria to get those nutrients, because at germination, they get what they need without even spending any effort or energy. And so it actually turns on the gene and says, hey, don't talk to your bacteria in your soil. You don't need to, you're going to get it for free. And that's where we see this huge problem with epigenetics. We've had some fields of our own that we've tried to transition away from using chemical fertilizers. And one field we ended up having to rip out because it had been in for probably about 50 years. It was a perennial grass, beautiful crop if we fertilized it, and it took 3 times as much water as all of our other fields. And especially compared to some areas where we had gotten away from these nitrogen coated seeds. So what we did about this is we actually started adding bacteria back in our soils. We started raising vermicompost in 2016. And what that is that vermicompost, we use red wrigglers. They actually propagate the bacteria that is part of that healthy, robust soil food web. And what they're doing is worms have this really cool little fascinating gut where as they consume food, they actually kill off bacteria that can be potentially harmful. This is your E. coli, your salmonellas, the things that tend to cause disease in plants. So the worm gut will actually destroy that, but they propagate things that tend to transport nutrients. A lot of your pseudomonases and your lactobacilluses are highly propagated in this worm poo. So you have a huge concentration now of the bacteria that we had slowly been killing off in our soils. Our soils were very, very low in any kind of bacterial or fungal activity at all from industrial farming, from disking, as well as a lot of fertilizer use. We did a significant amount of fertilizer use for our alfalfa crops. So we started raising some worms. And what we do is we take these worm castings and we make a brew out of them. It's just a cold extraction. So we put this right here is our brewer. So it's 500-gallon tank that we add water to. It's just straight well water. It's cold. There's aerators in the bottom so that it actually creates bubbles, because the bacteria out of these castings that we're after are aerobic. The majority of what we want for plants to cycle nutrients naturally is aerobic bacteria. So they need oxygen. So we fill these baskets with the castings. And then what I'm doing here is I'm actually feeding the bacteria. So I'm giving that bacteria. A lot of producers will use molasses. Molasses is a very, very quick sugar. So it's got a very short chain and it's consumed rapidly. What we use is actually a complex carbohydrate. This is some micronutrients, it's some minerals, and then it's also ground plant matter. We get this from a company called Growing Solutions. And so we feed that, and then we grow this bacteria for about 24 hours in this tank, and then we put that out to our fields. When we grow this bacteria, what here is in my hand, these castings, if I were to stick that in a mason jar, extract the bacteria right out of those castings and look at it under a microscope, I'd have about 10,000 CFU, colony forming units per milliliter of water. So every drop of water, I'd have about 10,000 colonies of bacteria. After a 24-hour brewing process, we actually have about 5 million colonies of bacteria per milliliter of water. So we're highly concentrating our bacteria, and then we're putting that out on our field. And remember, you know, bacteria is organic matter. So even half of it dies, they're still holding nutrients in their body. And then we're adding the bacteria out to help cycle these nutrients out of our soil naturally, rather than giving the plants chemical fertilizers and nitrogen directly. We're telling them, hey, you have to feed these bacteria in your soil. We're going to give you lots of bacteria. We want you to get the nutrients from them, not from us. And so that's where this epigenetics comes into play, of turning on these genes to get these plants to really function well in this system without very much input from us. And so, you know, what does this actually do for us? Well, some of the changes we've seen have been pest pressure. So here I have a photo from 2020. 2019 was a really wet winter. So 2020, we had lots of moisture, and what we saw was aphids on everything. So these are all black leg aphids. You can see that the alfalfa plant is actually shriveling. You can see these huge holes in it. You know, we had fields that the plant was withering and dying, and it was turning white because the aphids were sucking so much sap out of these plants that they were killing the plants. We were worried we were gonna lose our crops. And so our neighbors went ahead and sprayed pesticides, which kills not only your aphids, but it also kills all of your beneficials like these lovely ladybugs. So what we did is we actually made a worm tea brew, and we put it out on our field. And this is what we had in 5 days after application. So you can see here, these black leg aphids are absolutely destroying this alfalfa plant. And then, you know, 5 days later, and the worm tea is non-toxic. I can get it all over myself. We've done genetic testing on it. There's nothing in there that's really bad for you. And the best part is that it doesn't kill your beneficials. So we still had ladybugs. And this right here, I think I've got it on the next slide. So what this is it didn't kill all of them, but it killed the majority of them. So my ladybug's going to clean up this live guy. But this right here is an aphid that had its proboscis in this alfalfa plant. And what happened is this plant, with this excess of bacteria that we put out, was able to uptake enough nutrients. It made itself toxic to this aphid. Aphids can't digest complex sugars. So when this plant raised its sugar and nutrient content, the aphid actually desiccated. It gets so full of nutrients it can't digest, it'll pop. And so the body on this aphid, it was really cool to look at up close, was actually broken open, and it still was attached to this plant, but the plant had become toxic to it. Whereas our neighbor this year actually sprayed 3 times, and it's $30 an acre to spray the pesticides. And we didn't have to spray once. And so here's kind of some of the changes that we've seen. This is the exact same field. So we applied some worm teas in the fall. So early spring, what had happened is the bacteria had overwintered. Those plants ended up greening up and growing much faster in the spring because they had the bacteria in the soil needed to cycle these nutrients. And so you can see just the amount of bare ground where it was untreated versus our treated. And so this also goes to, oh yeah, so not all biostimulants are created equal. So a lot of chemical companies have started making what we would call bugs in a jug. And these are, you know, biologicals that are shelf stable versus what we have is the vermicompost. The vermicompost basically needs to be used because we're aerating it and it's a live product. It needs to be used within about 8 hours of us turning those aerators off. So for us, we make it on site and we take it right out to our fields and either inject it or we use a spray truck to spray it on. And so because I'm in an arid climate, we get 9 inches of rain a year. All of our water actually comes from a river. So we're either flood irrigating through pumps and pivot systems or through sprinkler systems. So where I can't inject our worm tea out onto our fields, we actually will go ahead and use a spray truck. And so here's kind of just a comparison of both the economics and the reality of using a vermicompost versus a bugs in a jug. Is our vermicompost had 790 different species, including fungi. We had about 100 different species of fungi in there. and it costs us about 44 cents per acre. Versus the 20 species in a bugs in a jug, they're pretty much all lactobacillus derived, which are good, but it's not a large variety. And then it's about $20 to $50 an acre. So economically, being able to make our own vermicompost has been very smart in a way to move forward in putting more soil biology back into our soil. And so, the economics of the matter are not just the cost of applying everything to the field, it's also the quality of the product that we have started raising. And this really focuses in on, our nutrient health and kind of the nutrient density in our plants. So here is the same field hay tests. So we have 2016, so we're alfalfa. So these are an alfalfa hay test, 2017, and I'm going to go through these really fast because I have a breakdown. So 2018 and then 2019. And so here's what that breakdown is. Some of the top things that dairy producers actually look at are crude protein. So that's like the direct amount of protein that the cow can consume out of the hay. You can see that we did increase. 2019, we actually had a lot of fires in California. So we had a lot of smoke, which means that our plants have less ability to photosynthesize because of the amount of smoke. We just don't have as much sunlight in that year. So I'm not surprised it was a little bit lower than 2018, but it still shows a significant increase over the years. ADF is our acid digestible fiber. So how fibrous is the plant? That number we want lower. The lower the number, the easier, the softer the plant is to digest. We saw a huge decrease. TDN, which is total digestible nutrients. This is actually the value that probably is our biggest deciding factor on what we're going to get paid per bale for our product. And if we look here, we can actually see TDN. There's a quality designation based on TDN on a 90% dry matter. Fair is 50 to 52, good is 52 to 54, premium is 54 to 55.9, and extra premium is anything above a 55.9. You can see we went from pretty good hay to off the charts. And we now even today have TDN that's in the 62 range, which is really, really high for alfalfa. It's very, very rare that you see producers producing that quality of hay. And with this, we actually stopped fertilizing as much. So we've reduced our fertilizer use dramatically by allowing the soil biology to do the work for us. And what we've seen is the nutritional quality in our product has gone above and beyond what we ever even thought was possible. And so, just vermicompost is definitely not enough to create a better working, healthy system for our plants. So we also try to encourage predatory bugs. Green lacewings are a local plant or a local bug that we have. The adults do not eat anything but floral nectar or non-floral nectar. So non-floral nectar is, if you've ever grabbed onto a sunflower and it's sticky, that's non-floral nectar. But their larvae eat aphids, and lots of them, and they eat thrip, and they eat bulb mites, and they eat all sorts of things that actually are very detrimental to a lot of the crops in our area. But the problem is if the adults don't have anything to eat, then they won't lay their eggs and larvae in areas where we need them to be. And the problem with pesticides that we have seen is pesticides will also kill all of these species. They're getting rid of our predatory bugs. So we've been working on encouraging the adults to stick around. One great way to do that is pollinator strips. This is a photo I got off of the internet of some wheat farmers that have started doing these pollinator strips. They give up a little section to provide this non-floral nectar to all of the different predatory bugs that we have. One thing we started doing is we have a lot of native sunflowers, so we stopped spraying them on the edges of our fields and on our ditch banks, and we started leaving them be. And actually, it's amazing what we saw was a huge upswing in the bird population more than anything. So, we not only increased our predatory bugs, but then they were feeding our bird population, and now our bird population has exploded. I was driving to check on some cattle yesterday, and I counted 11 hawks on one pivot alone. Red tail hawks is what we have. And I, in my entire life, cannot remember seeing that many hawks in one area. So it's really cool to see, in just a few years, you can have these massive swings of life back into the farmland by changing that. And we're producing a more nutrient dense product. So what did all of this do for us by changing how we started fertilizing our soils is we actually have 30% higher water retention. So that photo where John showed in July of the bale grazing, where he still had lots of moisture in that soil, that's what we have started to see. And in such a dry climate, this is a massively important thing for us. We have such little amount of water that every bit of water goes a long ways. We've seen increased organic matter in our soils from 2 to 3%. And for every 1% increase in organic matter, you actually increase the holding capacity of your water or of your soil by about 24,000 gallons per acre of water, which is great for us. That means my water is going to go a lot longer and it's going to stay in my soil longer. We have not sprayed a single pesticide since 2017. That year that we had those aphids, our neighbors spent $90 an acre on 1,000 acres. That's $90,000 that we didn't have to spend because we didn't need it. We have reduced our fertilizer use by 40% because we are taking bales off of our land and selling them. We are mining from our land. So we still use some fertilizers, but we have changed the type we use. We use a lot of compost now. We use a lot of manure now. And this has given us a lot higher quality crops. And then it's also a farm where we feel good about our ecosystem. And a big thing we have seen here, and this is going back to that epigenetics, is here's a 2-week-old alfalfa plant, and it has this beautiful, beautiful rhizosheath sheath. So this plant is already putting lots of sugars into the soil, and it's causing these soil particles through bacteria to stick to these roots like this. When we planted nitrogen-coated seeds, we never saw this. This didn't happen. I could pull plants right out of the soil and all of the soil would fall off of them. So this is beautiful aggregation happening on very young plants. And here's another example too, even just to show you the change in nutrients is we have vermicompost on the left, and it's really hard to tell in this photo, but the wheat is actually almost about a foot taller. This is my dad standing out in our field. And on the right, so this on the right was traditional. It was tilled, seeded, fertilized, and on the left was not tilled, and it was seeded directly in, and then it was not fertilized other than the worm teas. And we can see the dark green color. So you have that dark green color here, which is indicating higher nutrient and actually higher nitrogen. So these plants on the left that were given no nitrogen have higher nitrogen content in them, which equates to, in cattle feed, it actually equates to protein. Those nitrogens break down into protein sources that they can consume. Whereas on the right, we are having that more yellow lacking color. And so by some little changes, you can totally drastically change your soil health and also then your nutrition for your animals. So with that, I will wrap it up and open the floor to some questions. Let's see if I can.
Great presentation, Emily.
Thanks.
Yeah, I like the presentation on the vermicompost because I saw a producer here in Tabor. They've been utilizing vermicompost with great success too. So it's great. It's an interesting topic for sure.
Yeah, it's a really easy way to put bacteria back into really degraded soils, and you don't have to make it yourself. You can buy vermicompost. You can make really easy aerators at home. You can even just scatter vermicompost out in the dry matter form. You don't have to do the liquid form that we're doing. That just worked really well for us to do it that way.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we do have quite a few questions. Emily, you got quite a few questions. So what is the temperature of the brew for that when you're making that vermicompost?
So that's right out of our groundwater. It comes right out of our well. It's chilly. It's probably like 48 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't think it's more than like 50 degrees Fahrenheit. They call it a brew. It's not, it's an aerated product. It's just tap water, cold. I think 50 to like 75 degrees is ideal for the bacteria to grow, but I use what we have, which is tap water.
There you go. What percentage of soil organic matter would you estimate is from soil microorganisms?
Ooh, that is a really good question. That is a really complex question. I would actually estimate that it's close to 50% at least. So, you know, as those sugars, so what happens is your plant is photosynthesizing, taking the C off of your CO2, making it into complex carbohydrates and secondary metabolites. So these are your amino acids, these are your proteins, and these are your sugars. A lot of those sugars then get injected into the soil. The bacteria, protozoa, fungi then take that up, and that's your carbon, that's still organic matter. They're going to take that up and store that in their body systems. And then they also make secondary metabolites, which are basically amino acids. And like for a plant to say consume calcium, or we talk about phosphorus, phosphorus is almost 100% biologically driven into a plant. So it needs biology to absorb phosphorus. So plant says, hey, shorten phosphorus, need phosphorus early spring. They actually send out specific sugars indicating that. The bacteria will take it up, and then they take those secondary metabolites, the amino acids, and attach it to a phosphorus so it doesn't get bound into the soil, and then deliver that to the plant itself. And so, you know, easily 50%, I think, of your soil organic matter is actually biology. It's life. I don't have any research to back me up on that, but I'm assuming just from my understanding of how soil nutrient transport works, that's probably the case.
Great answer. We have another question here. So in dry conditions, with water being the limiting factor, I've heard that the additional bacteria added to a field die too quickly to be beneficial. What do you think about that?
It's not true. So we're we're in a really dry climate, and what happens is, like, kind of one of my favorite things to say is life begets life. So the more life you encourage to grow, the more life you tend to see. It takes my little asterisk is that it takes time. So as we started putting out this bacteria, we didn't see instantaneous results. It takes longer in a dry climate than it does in a wet climate for us to, you know, we sit at our soils when I first moved home, we're at like 0.5% organic matter, so low. We had no bacteria. Our soils were concrete. I couldn't sink a shovel in them. And then through several years of this, we're now sitting at 3 to 4% organic matter, which is really high for our area. We are very dry climate. I'll probably never see a 6 or 7 organic matter. It just doesn't exist because we just don't have enough water. But what we saw is as time went by and I started adding that bacteria, you'll lose some, but then the plants will actually cycle the dead bacteria themselves. And what we saw is that this bacteria starts to, you know, cycle itself. And so as we started doing this, we saw more and more beneficial changes. And now I can go out, sink a shovel in without any effort, higher water holding capacity. And then the other thing is so we have quite a few farming neighbors, also alfalfa farmers. We see that our bacteria is overwintering heavily because if we get snow, our snow melts first. And it's because the bacteria in the soil is metabolizing. And with that metabolizing, they're actually raising the temperature of the soil. So you can see in the spring when snow starts to melt, our fields green up first and they melt snow first. I should fly a drone one time because there was at one point where you could literally see a map of our property versus our neighbors because the snow was gone off of ours because our soils are warmer. So you will get to a point where in a dry climate, it doesn't matter. You're going to cycle those nutrients by adding bacteria back in.
Wow, that's crazy. John answered a question to one of the producers. I thought it was a really good question. If you could answer it live, John. So it's here are a bunch of questions, but take your time in answering. Do you feed test while bale grazing, and when? What times of the fall or winter do you bale graze? Do you have issues with mud? And do you pull the twine or net wrap off the bales when you place the bales or right before you feed?
So we do feed test. We like to feed test in the fall. and just helps us be able to make our plans. The house cat wants to talk here. Helps us make our plans for whether we need any supplementation through the winter. And at the same time in the fall, before it freezes up here, we'll try to pull any twine or nets off, just because it's not frozen to the bale and we don't have to worry about the cattle eating it. So we have bale graze from anytime from late November right through until early May, and mud has potential to be a challenge. But when we're dealing with unfrozen ground, and especially if our sod is a little weaker, then we move the animals more frequently. So it might be every 3 days we'll bale graze. We might give them a few less bales, but move it more often so they get off that piece of ground a little quicker. And the other thing, just kind of standard for any of our grazing management, is if you're working with a perennial sod in particular, you've got a lot more root matter. Annuals tend to be, fairly weak sods. But if you have a taller grass going into that, so often we'll stockpile the grass where we're bale grazing as well. So that way we have a lot more grass there. It acts like between the above ground biomass and the root matter, they act like a bit of a snowshoe to help cushion the hoof action on the soil so that they don't produce mud nearly so quickly.
Oh, awesome. And then another question I got for you. So what time frame are you looking? Oh yeah. What time frame are you bale grazing your sheep flock, and when do you lamb relative to that?
So, well, we start to bale graze our sheep flock is, once the snow gets too deep. Like this past year, it was 2 weeks ago that we had to bring them home off the stockpiled tall fescue. And so we lamb in April, May, and we'll bale graze right through lambing until the sheep go back out to pasture. It's actually having those little piles of hay, the residual stuff from the bale grazing, is a great spot for the lambs to curl up in the sun. Works out quite nice and gets them out of the barn, so it's healthier for them that way.
Mhm. That's awesome. Another question for you, Emily.
Yeah.
Is that increase in sugars within those alfalfa plants what people talk about when they talk about increasing the bricks in their crop?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. So we started off with a Brix of about a 4 or 5, which is really low. Alfalfa is not like fruit. Fruit gets into the 20s. We've seen Brix anywhere from like 12 to 14, which is high for alfalfa. That's, I think the highest Brix you can get in alfalfa is about 16. But Brix reads any solubles in the sap. So it's not just the sugars, it's also those amino acids, those proteins, those peptides, those secondary metabolites that are in there as well. But the higher those are, the healthier plant is, because it has more nutrients essentially. So yep, higher Brix is always great.
Great. And then are these hay quality indicators you shared getting better over the years, accounting for any changes in harvest timing, so height and or growth stage?
Nope. So those were all the same crop, harvested at relatively the same stages. So in alfalfa, if alfalfa goes to bloom, your TDN is going to go down because the plant is putting a lot of sugars into the nectar in those plants. And so those were all the same crop that we harvested before bloom. We get about 4 crops a year in our area. The first crop does not go to bloom. Second and third go to bloom on purpose. We actually harvest them as a lower sugar content alfalfa. And then the fourth crop is harvested before bloom. So those were same field, same crop each year in a row to try and account for that. And we have that field in particular, I couldn't track through the years because we rotated it into a wheat crop, but we've seen that trend across all of our fields basically.
And for clarification, are all your fields irrigated?
Yeah, so we don't have any dryland farming. We are native sagebrush habitat. So if we don't water it, it's sagebrush. Which that's what we run our cattle on. So our cattle run on sagebrush ground, and there's a lot of like Indian rice grass, winter fat, Mormon tea, shad scale, bitter brush. There's a lot of forages for the cattle that are native to this area, but it's very, very arid. There's a lot of sandy bare ground in our area if it's not irrigated land.
Then John, I have a question with regards to bale grazing. With the weeds and stuff, do you see, or even maybe not weeds, maybe just native plants that get introduced, do you see increased competition in those fields when depending on the plant or anything like that, or is it pretty well controlled, I guess?
Well, in our environment, so if there are weeds coming in with the hay, we will see that especially in the first year. But where we have enough moisture, unless the weed is particularly competitive, by year two, the grasses and clovers that tend to be our more dominant species in our naturalized pastures will usually crowd out any weeds once they get their feet back under them. And if we do see weed issues that way, actually we'll use a fairly high stock density grazing to take them out fairly quickly.
Oh, that's good to know. Let's see, we got 6 more questions here. So, Emily, how much water per hectare do you use for one irrigation?
We're using about 4 acre feet per acre. We don't run in hectares, so I don't really know. It's not a it's not a tremendous amount of water. We do some flood irrigating, so it tends to be a lot of water very quickly in a short period of time. But then we'll go 32 days without water again on our perennial plants. So, it's a lot of water at once, and that's where the water holding into our soils becomes very, very important, is because we want whatever water we put out there to stay there and stay available to our plants.
When significant amounts of N are exported from fields and harvested grains, there's a net loss of N from the system. I am unclear how this system is able to maintain N levels without N fertilizers to support global levels or levels of food production. Have you collected data on the N balance of this system, especially for non-leguminous crops over multiple growing seasons?
That is an excellent question. So the answer is that we have about 580 metric tons per acre in the atmosphere of nitrogen. So I shouldn't have to put any nitrogen out on my field. If you are doing grain crop after grain crop after grain crop after grain crop, you are not going to basically be able to do that. The trick is to rotate your crops to where you can get that nitrogen for free. And so like when we're raising grain crops, we're rotating out of an alfalfa crop into a grain crop. We've even done some corn and different kinds of oats. We'll actually plant peas or vetch in with them, especially if we're chopping it for silage. And that's our way of getting free nitrogen, but then also rotating from the alfalfa into like a grain crop. We don't have to nitrogen fertilize them, and they grow fantastic. Once you have healthy, biologically working soils, because the bacteria is going to pull that nitrogen out of the atmosphere, you have to have good, healthy, fluffy soils too, because you've got to get that air, that nitrogen down at the root zone for the bacteria to transport it. And I shouldn't have to put any nitrogen fertilizer on. My plants can, and I mean that grain crop showed it. So even as we're harvesting a grain crop and it's taking nitrogen off, I still have nitrogen above my head. So that's why.
Oh, wow. Another question here. So in regards to nitrogen-coated seeds, you mentioned that the plants decided that they were going to have a free ride and didn't need to cooperate with the soil biology because of this free nitrogen. How does the plant distinguish that seed applied nitrogen from nitrogen that it would come in contact with from an organic source?
Organic sources are chelated. So when you have nitrogen that's cycling from bacteria to plant, they're chelated to an amino acid or some type of protein or peptide. It's in a different form. The nitrogen that we're providing is some kind of, like ammonium nitrate, or it's a chemical form that's been stabilized and it volatilizes really quickly. And it's also in a form that the plant can't readily absorb. It can uptake it quickly, but then what happens is if you put out like a granular nitrogen fertilizer, the plant has to absorb it with the water. And as it does that, the plant itself has to chelate it, has to add either amino acids or peptides, depending on what it needs the nitrogen for. And that causes the plant to actually take its own energy rather than the bacteria in the soil doing that. So when bacteria transports nitrogen, it's in the form the plant can use immediately. When we give them nitrogen, it's in a form that they have to convert. And that's where you see a lot of pest pressure, is actually when they are having to convert this nitrogen themselves rather than the bacteria doing it.
Oh, nice. Three more questions. So what rate are you applying the brew at?
Our brew, it's anywhere from 4 to 5 gallons per application. We normally apply it twice a year. And I'm saying that because we have a 500-gallon brewer. If I do it on our pivots are 120 acres. So I do 500 gallons to the 120-acre pivots. If we do it in our spray truck, we can only do about 100 acres with the spray truck. So I always recommend getting it out there is better than nothing at all. That is the rate that works for us because that's what I can physically accomplish without spinning my wheels to try and calculate it better.
Yeah. Oh, okay. And then what is the food source for the red wrigglers? What types of volumes are you working with per worms and liquid brew? And what application rates and frequency of the application are you doing?
That's a great question. So we feed our red wrigglers a lot of our own moldy food. So I am trying to inoculate our red wrigglers with our own native bacteria. So plants, bacteria is not just in the soil, it's actually in your phloem and xylem. It's on the surface of your leaf. It's in the roots. Your plant is fully encompassed with it. And so we actually take bales of alfalfa that have gotten rained on and we pre-compost them with some of our grass hays as well. And so we pre-compost that because alfalfa can get really hot because it's got a lot of nitrogen in it naturally. And the worms don't like it that way. So we actually put them in onion crates and just get it starting to mold because the bacteria is actually not after the food itself. They're after, or the worms are after the bacteria, not the food itself. So we get it pre-composting, feed it to the worms. We feed them about once a week. And then we, apply 4 to 5 gallons per acre twice a year. We like to do it early in the spring. Soils are cold. That's when plants need phosphorus the most, and phosphorus is fully bacterially driven for nutrient uptake. So we spray it on early spring, and then we like to do it in the fall. We like to do it in the fall because as plants go dormant, they actually pull all their nutrients and their bacteria out of the above ground leaf surface and inject that into the soil. And we've seen by giving them extra bacteria in the fall, we actually have bigger root growth throughout the winter. We'll actually have huge root growth throughout the winter by doing that fall application.
Interesting. That's really interesting. Interesting. Wow.
Yeah. So even though the plant looks dormant, we've seen huge root growth all winter long.
Yeah. Huh. And have you seen an increase in stand longevity in vermicomposted alfalfa fields versus not, and always straight alfalfa fields?
Yes. So we have seen a huge increase in longevity of our alfalfa fields. The alfalfa tends to stay softer much longer. And then we're also seeing not as much disease pressure. So in alfalfa, a lot of the times, because we're cutting with a swather, you start to see about 6 or 7 years of age, you start to see a lot of crown rot. So it's rot that's forming right at the crown of the plant where it's being cut. We don't see that as often, and we're definitely not rotating as often. We're rotating now more like every 10 years because our plants are still testing. That's the other thing, is the hay has to test high quality for us to keep a crop in. And so we're seeing that our hay tests longer for much older plants. And then we just don't see the disease issues.
And then last question. Aside from nitrogen, are you soil testing for other nutrient levels like P or phosphorus, K, and micronutrients? And how do you balance those nutrients in your system?
Yeah, so absolutely. So we do soil tests regularly. And I take a soil test probably every other year per field is my attempt to track that organic matter. We will apply some micronutrients as needed. Like I said, we have really high molybdenum, so we will put on, it ties up several different things, but we see a lot of boron deficiencies in our area. So we put on some micronutrient boron. And what I found is if you are adding nutrients, you just have to make sure you're getting them in a form that is biologically available versus like traditional nitrogen fertilizers are what I would call like a chemical fertilizer versus a biologically available fertilizer. And those are salts that dissolve in water. the plant has no choice but to uptake it, and it's not in a chelated form. So we look for stuff that's either in a chelated form. Micronutrients like boron, zinc, selenium, magnesium, those don't have to be chelated, but you have to have healthy biology to uptake them. But your bigger stuff like your NPK, it's really important that it's chelated. And so we use a phosphorus product. Actually, it's a foliar phosphorus product called Free Phos. It's chelated, it's biologically available. We can literally put it in with our worm tea and it doesn't kill the worm, the bacteria from the worm tea. And so that one we actually spray that out with our worm tea. So finding biologically available fertilizers is where you really kind of need to direct yourself. And that's where we've reduced our fertilizers by 40%. Now we're using specific fertilizers that are more designed to work with the system we've created.
That's great. If that is all for questions, I want to extend my thanks to everyone who joined us today, and a special thank you to John and Emily for their informative presentations today, though they were fabulous presentations, and also to all the other presenters that we had for the 4th annual nutrient management webinar series. I'd also like to thank everybody that was able to attend all the webinar series and sessions in the past 3 weeks. I hope you enjoyed them all and were able to gain new insights from our wonderful presenters. There will be a survey sent out tomorrow to everyone. If you could complete the survey, it'd be greatly appreciated, as it helps me determine next year's topics and how we can improve the webinar series. Lastly, a link to the recordings will also be sent, and the recordings should be uploaded shortly, sometime this week. And thanks everyone, and we'll see you next year.